Hey everybody, I thought I'd do a little impromptu live stream tonight because I just figured out that you can actually do a live stream on Twitter or X. And I found out at the same time you can simulcast it over to YouTube. So I thought, why not put it in both places? Now, I did find out that if I'm doing a live broadcast here on Twitter, this one is also simulcast on YouTube. You can't do comments in the feed and have me see them while I'm doing the live stream, but you can over on the YouTube side. So if you want to go over there, my username over there is the same as on Twitter. It's just at timothyandholt.com. But what I wanted to do was kind of look a little bit at Tom Clancy and his career. I've been kind of going through it on longer YouTube videos that are sort of 20 or 25 minutes long per book. And it's been a lot of fun because there was this rumor running around about him from the early days, even during Hunt for Red October, that he was more than just an author. He was some asset. People were feeding him information. Was he actually getting information from places he shouldn't have? And so I decided to go back and reread all the original books. And I've made it this far. I've made it to Some of All Fears. And I started kind of earlier this year with Hunt for Red October, Red Storm Rising. I've gone through them in publication order, not chronological order. The reason I wanted to do that was so that I could really kind of get a handle on, was he, you line it up with the history of the time and say, okay, let's look at exactly when this was written and exactly what was going on. I didn't want to see anything revisionist. I wanted to see it in the order that the man himself published it. So I've made it as far as the Sum of All Fears, which was an interesting read. But if you do these in order, you find out some interesting stuff. And starting with Hunt for Red October, which I'll get to in a minute. But I wanted to say something about Red Storm Rising. It's not a Jack Ryan book. It is collaborative with Larry Bond, even though Tom Clancy's the only name on it. It's very much a Larry Bond book as well. And stylistically, that's very obvious. Now, chronological order to the story, the books come in a little bit different order. I'm reading Without Remorse next because it was the one published right after Sum of All Fears. Red Winter was published after Tom Clancy had passed away, but I'm not sure that one was going to tell me much about whether or not he was an asset or just an author who happened to kind of write these sort of spy thrillers. So let's look at Hunt for Red October for a minute. Now, remember, this book was published in 1984, right? This is Reagan's in office, height of the Cold War, lots of stuff going on around the world. This book comes out in 84. It was put out by the Naval Institute Press. Now, Naval Institute Press, like almost never, I think this may be one of two or three that they published that were fiction novels. They never touch this stuff. They're more for memoirs of some naval aviators, some sub captains, some admiral. They're history books certainly, but they're never really fiction. So they do this book. It gets 14,000 copies, which is an initial print run. It's one of the only Tom Clancy books I actually don't have a first edition of, but it gets a 14,000 copy print run through this press that doesn't ever do this stuff. So that was sort of a hint that, hey, something weird happened, but okay, let's let that part go for a minute. If you look at that and say, okay, well, that's interesting. October 84 is when it comes out. February 1985, he's got a movie deal inked 4 months after release. And if you look now and go backwards and say, hey, look, how do you get that deal? The movie deal was actually done based on galley proofs. So somebody sent the movie producer proofs of the book before it was even published. And that's when the movie kind of got lifted off, which is just weird for a debut author. But that in and of itself doesn't really say, hey, look, was he an asset or was he just a writer? An insurance salesman turned writer. Well, the movie comes out in October 1990. It was a massive success. It was everywhere. The book was huge. I mean, when it came out, it did okay. It started to sell all right, and then all of a sudden, a copy of it shows up on Reagan's desk when a reporter was in there taking pictures of the president. And shocker, it started to sell much better. So that leads you to believe, was he just the luckiest bastard on the face of the planet, or was there kind of more to the story? And again, if you want to comment, you have to go over to the YouTube side. YouTube will let you do that. On the Twitter side, it doesn't. This is being simulcast in both places. But So anyway, it winds up on Reagan's desk. Of course, it becomes an overnight success after that, and you're off to the races. So again, he's either shockingly lucky or he had a little help. And I'm not willing to draw the line on this is proof that he was an asset based on this, but let's just go with lucky for a minute. But insurance salesman gets into the Naval Institute Press. He's not having any connection to the Navy. Winds up on Reagan's desk. He's just a lucky bastard, right? I mean, that's just about the only way to look at it. Fast forward a couple of years, he's coming off this. I think the next year, actually, he's coming off the success of Hunt for Red October. Red Storm Rising comes out. Now, Red Storm Rising was collaborative with Larry Bond, and Tom Clancy wrote an introduction to the book that basically said it's as much Larry Bond's book as his. Excuse me, trying to keep my throat going. And the Larry Bond book, the Larry Bond writing style is much different than Tom Clancy's writing style. Now, if you read it objectively and then you read all the other Tom Clancy books next to it, the writing style is shockingly different between the two. So I look at that one now and I go, how much did Clancy really have to do with that? Because it's one of the best page turners I've ever seen in the sort of bigger war genre. It's an area I write in, and it's fantastically written, absolute page turners, like 600 pages long, and it's one of those books that's just tough to put down. And it really gets into the head of what it's like to put boots on the ground as a soldier and have them pull trigger against human targets. It basically is a giant book about propaganda against a coming global war. We don't want World War III. Because remember, it's mid-'80s. We're still talking about, are we going to go to war with the Russians? This is basically propaganda that you don't want to do it, and shows that the United States would have won that conflict, pretty handily. If you believe the book. Now, Russia might not have had they read it, but if you believe it from our side, we would have kicked their ass. But the writing style is so different, it leads you to question how much Clancy really had to do with it. But again, that in and of itself has absolutely no bearing on whether or not he was just an author or an asset. And if you want me to see your comments, again, I'm going to repeat this a couple of times as people come in and out. You do have to go to YouTube. That functionality does not exist on Twitter, and this is live streamed in both places. Now, but the part about getting into a soldier's head like that, I found interesting. Because Clancy does it in all his books. He basically says, hey, if you're a good guy and you got to pull the trigger against a human target, you're going to think about that for a minute. If the human target's shooting at you, it's a different equation, right? If it's, hey, this person, I'm the first one to pull trigger here, what's going to happen, right? That's a whole different equation. And it does show the human side of those conflicts, which, a lot of soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan suffer from PTSD. Because they've made that decision, or they saw their friends or other things. But the point Clancy makes quite well throughout all of his books, and Red Storm Rising is absolutely no exception to that, is that there's an emotional price to pay to being in combat. And he was kind of making a pitch, I think, in that book through a fictional sense of not having sort of a larger global war. Because it would take a toll on everyone. And I think modern writers could kind of get away from that, right? So I'm a big fan of a lot of action books. I've written some. I enjoy reading them. Lee Child is no exception. I love his stuff. But Reacher is a whole different character, right? So you take a Reacher book versus a Tom Clancy book, and Reacher doesn't care. He'll shoot somebody in the head and turn around and have a burrito, right? He doesn't care one way or the other. And there's almost no emotional, he's very emotionally detached from that process. He can sort of separate those two. And that's a very unique skill. And yeah, some people can do that, but it's not common. And Clancy digs deeper into that not common part. So he comes out of Red Storm Rising. So now we've got Hunt for Red October, Red Storm Rising, 2 books perfectly timed, 2 books to really to do as much propaganda as anything else to help the United States in the Cold War. And now we're off to the races, right? Because now Tom Clancy is very well known, and he can kind of do sort of whatever he wants to a certain extent. And again, neither of those 2 books really solidify in my head, was he an intelligence agency asset, or was he just a writer who was really good at picking at timing, right? And did he just get super lucky? But then you fast forward to Patriot Games. And I want to preface this with something. If he was an asset, and I keep harping on that, if he was an intelligence agency asset, he may not have known it. He might have just had people whispering stuff to him, because the dude loved to talk to people, right? He loved to go around and socialize and, be Tom Clancy, right? Sit in rooms with admirals and generals, and people would tell him stuff. And, he loved that part of it. Now you get into Patriot games, and the book is shockingly good at connecting a lot of dots again, and not just like good at it. I mean, shockingly good at it. Remember, this was late 80s. This was way pre 9/11. The world did not know, especially here in the United States, we didn't know as much about terrorism as we do today in the post 9/11 world because we all learned about it. But he connected a lot of dots. He's like, what is terrorism? And he goes to great lengths to kind of discuss that. Now, if you're a nation the size of the United States, and a smaller group, whether it's a nation or some organization like Al Qaeda, wants to alter our policies, you can't come in and dictate to us, right? We're too big economically, we're too big militarily, and if you try to defeat us in nuclear in armed combat, we're pretty much going to kick your ass, right? Especially if you're smaller than we are. I'm not saying that to be arrogant. I'm just saying we got the tools, right? We've got the smart bombs to do it. So terrorism is your only option. There's only two ways we lose a war, right? And that's terrorism or nuclear war. Nobody wins in a nuclear war, but that's some of all fears. We'll get to that. From Business Suite, and in the terrorism side is about the only thing you're left with. So, he does say, hey, look, some people don't like the policies of the United States. Some people are going to try to alter that, and maybe terrorism is one way they could do it. He's talking about Irish terrorists in the UK, but I think you can see the analogy because at the time, the problems the UK was having with Ireland was where a lot of quote unquote terrorist activity was taking place, and a lot of that book is set in the United States, but it's Irish terrorists. So, but he does make a point in that book that is very well taken. Now, if you look backwards and say, okay, this came out in the late 80s, pre 9/11. He does make a very clear point in the book that if you want to defeat terrorism, if you really want to stomp it out, all the big countries in the world have to work together. You can't have Russia work on it or the United States work on it or the UK work on it or France work on it. We all have to kind of work together or we're not going to eradicate it. And post 9/11, we lived in a world where people did kind of work together a little bit and we were kind of making some headway. Now the entire world is sort of bifurcated and we've got hotspots all over the world and who knows if terrorism is going to pop back up. Some terrorist activity has, but not to a 9/11 scale. So let's hope it doesn't. But, if we really want to eradicate it, he makes the point that the world really has to work together. And I'm not sure if it popped up today, if we would actually be ready to start to build that coalition to go off and attack it together. Because let's just say Russia and us are probably not on the best of speaking terms right now. We're not, it wouldn't necessarily go all that well. Now, those three in a row, he's kind of proven a couple of things to me. So you've got Hunt for Red October, you've got Red Storm Rising, you've got Patriot games. Dead nuts on timing of release, right? The day those things come out, I mean, it's like could have been ripped from the headlines kind of stories. It just absolutely perfect. It's sort of peeking a little bit around the corner and saying, what could the world look like, in 2 years? And it just nails it 3 for 3 times. Hunt for Red October being a slight exception to that. But the thing that got him a lot of attention on that one is that even admirals, some high-placed Navy guys were looking at the book going, how the heck did he figure that stuff out from open source material? And the book almost didn't see the light of day a couple times because they were like, nope, can't publish that, right? But then, instantly a couple of weeks later, he gets a free pass, right? For a debut author, that's just weird. Again, especially with the Naval Institute Press. But those 3 books together, haven't really turned me around the edge of was he getting information from someplace. Cardinal of the Kremlin is the one that kind of pushed me to 5149 into the he was getting information from somebody category and started to push me over that edge. And again, some more people joined. If you want to comment so that I can see it, you have to go over to YouTube. Twitter doesn't have that functionality. And my username over there is exactly the same as it is on Twitter. The Cardinal of the Kremlin is one that was never made into a movie. Excellent book. If you haven't read it, give it a shot. But the book opens with Afghanistan and Russia having a little issue, something we learned a lot about, in the post 9/11 world. But this was Russia's shot at Afghanistan. Hey, party at Ground Zero, hello. This book is basically just giant propaganda in a way, and it's perfectly timed because remember, Russia still hadn't fallen apart. The USSR still hasn't fallen apart yet. It's still the USSR. And to me, this book is almost rock solid on the propaganda side, especially in the Afghanistan side, because Russia was getting their butts kicked in there. The USSR, sorry, was getting their butts kicked there, and we kind of helped, right? We were like, hey, we're not going to send people, but we'll send weapons. But we didn't send our A-level weapons. We sent sort of our B-level weapons, right? And we gave them these guys, and we sort of trained them, and they came back to hurt us later. But it basically showed Russia in print, hey, look, we're doing this. We're doing it. We're doing it. Now our public knows we're doing it. And hey, look, here's what it really looks like. It's ripping you guys to shit. And we've put it in a book now. And he was either, again, perfect timing, or, he was getting people chatting in his ear. Now the book does more than that. And this book, Cardinal the Kremlin, is one of my sort of favorites of his, mainly because I used to work in missile defense. I worked on Patriot Missile. I was part of the upgrade team for the battle manager on Patriot Missile back when I worked in the defense industry, which I haven't for years. And if anybody asked me now, I'd be like, yeah, missiles fly. I don't know. They shoot stuff. I haven't worked in it in a decade. But the pitch in the book, and remember, he's really good at propaganda, right? He's really good at saying things that kind of get congressmen and senators to pay attention, and if they pay attention, does that help get funding through, and does that help sort of our cause to build a better whatever it is that's in the book, right? Better anti-terrorist group for Patriot games. Cardinal the Kremlin goes deep into missile defense programs, and it goes super deep into them. It goes into the laser weapons that were supposed to be part of Star Wars, which, by the way, never worked. I know people that worked on those programs very well. And those never worked the way they were supposed to. But he goes into a lot of depth about several things, and we're going to get to one of them in a minute. But he goes into a whole lot of depth about when you build an effective missile shield, and if you build a very effective missile shield, can you build it to the point where it's good enough that you could actually win in a nuclear war? And does that upset the balance of power? Russia was working on missile shields. We obviously worked on missile shields. We had a lot of money flying into the laser versions of that for a while, which were supposed to be far more effective than the anti-missile missiles. But it basically was propaganda to say, hey, let's pour tons of money into that missile shield. And we ultimately did, and we've ultimately got a really good one that can knock down all kinds of stuff. But thankfully, we never had to find out with nuclear war in a large exchange. But the technical descriptions of the laser technology and the artificial intelligence used in part of that laser technology are absolutely spot on. I mean, just absolutely dead nuts on. So this was written in 1988, right? So he was so absolute dead nuts on. I had to go bust out old textbooks and say, look, would this have been known in 88? And could a guy who's, an insurance salesman have figured it out? Well, by this time, Clancy was more famous, right? He could have just called some universities and had somebody talk him through it and got away with that. And maybe he did. But his technical descriptions, his physics descriptions of how some of the stuff works were so good. I mean, ludicrously good. I'm sitting here with pen and paper going, is that really going to work that way? Dead on. I mean, absolutely right. Now, the other thing is he described how you would use artificial intelligence to help that laser become more effective. And the AI side is something I actually work in now and have for the last 10 years. Sort of tertiarily, I've worked with AI for 20, 25 years. But as my primary job, it's been for the last decade. And the way he explained the AI working in here is, again, absolutely dead nuts on. And this was, late 80s, so it's not as common knowledge as it was today. I even have notes for this discussion. Now, coming out of those 4 books, I came out of that one 51-49, because that last book hit exactly at the right time to start to get additional money through Congress for missile shield work that we desperately needed at the time. Nailed it. Right? Exactly right. So was somebody chattering in his ear saying, hey, think about this and go make that your next one. And it became really important to some people, some of the right people. Now, before we move on to clear and present danger, I just want to repeat, if you're watching on Twitter and you want to comment, I can't see your comments, but if you go over to YouTube, my username is exactly the same, and you can leave comments there and I'll see them live. Twitter or X or whatever Elon calls it doesn't let us do that, but it'll let me simulcast this in both places. Now, clear and present danger. Again, if you look at it in reverse versus when it came out, you can tell that this book was absolutely perfectly timed to be almost propaganda-like to help the first George Bush with some problems that he had when he became president, and that's right when this hit the market. Right when Bush needed it to. Now, Senior Bush had a lot of deep connections at the CIA, right? He just did. He was director over there, even back in the 60s, as he was over in the down the street from the White House, in one of the Senate offices. He certainly had deep connections there when he was a senator. Now, the point to this book was the CIA at the time was not getting the funding they needed to really do everything themselves. And the book has a Army team and a CIA team working together to eradicate this stuff with drug dealers. So it brings up sort of a moral question, or a question that is difficult to answer. If you're doing intel agency work, and you're going after drug dealers, you're going after terrorists, you're doing whatever it is that intel agencies do, and you fire upon civilians who aren't necessarily part of another military, is that okay? Is that against the law? And the book actually digs deep with lawyers and starts to talk about all that stuff. And it also brought up the moral question, because if you've seen the movie that came out of this one, you know that they were using Army Green Beret teams, or special operations. They never specified it, don't think. It was Army, so it had to be Green Berets or Delta. But in the book, it was Green Berets. But it brings up the point: if you're going to use the military against drug dealers, is that legal? Can you get away with that? Because you're basically using our military assets up against civilian targets. And do we wind up pulled in front of the UN for that? Or does it just wind up looking bad for a president when he has to go back in front of Congress or run for re-election? And there's a bunch of that in the book too. But it does dig into that should we, shouldn't we thing. And I think him digging into that should we, shouldn't we thing really led to a lot of, hey, let's go get more money from Congress so that the agency doesn't have to go ask for help, right? They can go do all this stuff on their own. And the intel agencies grew, and next thing you know, we've got a bigger CIA. And other orgs as well. And that's kind of weird, because he actually brings up in this one and in other books that, hey, a lot of the agency work is sort of, stovepiped, where I might know something you need to know, but you don't know what I exist, and you don't know what I know, and you don't know what my files have, so you can't necessarily figure out where I am, which is a problem we struggled with trying to, deal with 9/11, right? It's still a problem we struggle with today, but now we got more of a scale problem. So this problem was known when this book hit. And it's something we had to go sort of emergency fix after 9/11. But he brought it up way back here in Clear and Present Danger, which means he was looking around that corner again, right? He knew enough about how these agencies worked to really deal with it. Yeah, he still trafficked cocaine, and a lot of weird things happen with the Central Intelligence Agency. But the book came out at exactly the right time for Bush taking office to really kind of make those arguments. Now, whether or not it was, he did everything he was supposed to do with that money, or whether or not he got it from other places, another story. Now, fast forward to Sum of All Fears, which I just dropped a video on over on YouTube this morning. Sum of All Fears deals with a concept that I've actually dug into very carefully for one of the books I wrote, and that is nuclear weapons in the hands of the wrong people. And how do you define the wrong people? Now, we all saw Oppenheimer when it came out last year, and there were, multiple Oscars won for that movie. It was very well researched. I worked at MIT for years. I've met people that were depicted in the movie. They're much older when I met them, but I've met some of the people that were actually depicted in it, and I've worked with people who got their doctoral degree under some of those guys, and been to Los Alamos National Labs. To build a nuclear weapon the first time was the really hard part, right? It ain't the first time anymore, and it's not the 1940s. The basic science is really well known, and in Sum of All Fears, it's really well laid out. Now, Clancy, to figure that out, didn't need to go off and find something classified. He needed a bunch of physics textbooks. There's actually a series of books also by a guy named Richard Rhodes that lays it out pretty well. All except the final calculations. But if you know the physics and you've got a physicist, you can calculate it. It's not hard to do. The construction techniques are not hard to do anymore. And the point the book makes, and this is an area I've worked in as well, is that it's not a matter of can you stop somebody from building and keep the technology safe. That's too late. That's out. People know how to do that. It becomes a question of can they get the material. Now, the only thing in a nuclear weapon that's really hard to get is the radioactive material, right? You need the right isotope of the right material to go off and build a bomb. And I've got a video on my YouTube channel that actually talks about that from public source information. But it says, here's the isotopes you need. It's all out there. You can find it on your own. But I laid it out in a video if you want to go watch that. Now, the point he makes in the book is that if you give somebody with a couple $1 million in the right amount of time, the right material, they can build a weapon and put it someplace. It's not 1940s anymore, right? Delivering them is not that hard. You could FedEx it, for goodness sake, right? Put it in a private jet, fly it around the world, and make it through customs. Drive it into, fly it into Mexico and drive it across the southern border. Fly it into Canada and drive it across the border. If you want to get one in the United States, you can find a way to do it. Not that hard. If you want to build one, the only tough part is getting the starting material. Where do you get the starting material? Well, the United States has lost multiple nuclear weapons in our history. One of them sitting in a swamp in Louisiana someplace. We never did find it. Other countries have lost them. And in the book, they use sort of this idea that Israel lost one that they never admitted they had. And the material from that wound up in terrorist hands or German hands, actually, in this group that wanted to see Germany rise to the top again. And the concept Germany had, or this little group of sort of leftover Nazis had, was let's get the United States and Russia to beat each other up, right? Let's get those two to fight, and then we can rise to the surface. And it basically made the point that when there's political chaos in the world, other groups can come in and sort of start to take over. And if you look right now, we have political chaos and a lot of hotspots popping up all over the world. So again, Tom Clancy is sort of looking at the future, and maybe he's just really good at saying, hey, let's play the what if game. And maybe these are obvious things, but remember when he wrote this is 91, right? This is way back. This was not yesterday. This was 30 years ago. So it lends itself to the question of, was he talking to people who really kind of knew these things were actual issues? Because I don't think they were as commonly known as they are today. And especially from the nuclear side. Because at the time, again, some of our fears hit kind of at the right time, where we needed to start working on sensors for trying to detect or track where nuclear material goes as it comes out of reactors. And a lot of those sensor networks are in place. That material is very closely guarded, except for the nuclear weapons we've lost, which are out there somewhere, who knows where. But if that material gets sort of in the hands of people who don't mind doing things with it, this is why reactor inspections are important from the IAEA, places like Iran. We like to go and inspect those reactors, and we haven't had a chance to recently. And if you don't, what happens to the waste products? Well, the waste products that coming out of reactors are useful in weapons. So you have this little problem, right? You need to track that material carefully. And generally it is. The technology now exists, whereas it didn't previous to that. But again, the book comes out at exactly the right time to sort of peg that, right? So, if you ask me today, after some of the fears, was he sort of just a guy who was crazy good at connecting dots? Was he just a guy who was superb at figuring stuff out? Or did he know a few things and were people whispering in his ear? And did he really know that they were whispering in an attempt to kind of go get him? And was he just out having fun talking to people? Or at least what he thought. Well, I don't know. It's kind of a tough question to answer. But I've got a whole playlist over on YouTube of me walking through each one of these books in a lot more detail than this. And I'm going to keep reading them. Without Remorse is the next one published. Then comes Executive Orders. And I think if we go all the way through Teeth in the Tiger, I think it's going to continue to kind of become a little more obvious, or maybe it won't. Maybe it'll become less obvious. But when I watch this documentary that you see on streaming channels floating around about, the real Tom Clancy, they do bring up the question of, was he an asset, or was he just a writer, or was he just getting information from someplace, or was he just lucky? And when I first saw it, I'm like, no way. Let's forget it, right? He was just a guy. But Insurance Salesman turned into best-selling author who's just that good at predicting the future. If you start to look at these things in hindsight and lay it all out, I'm still not 100% convinced, but It would not take a lot to push me over that edge. I'm probably 60-40, 55-45 in favor of at this point. He was at least having people whisper in his ear, right? I mean, let's just admit that at this point. Whether or not, they should have, or whether or not they were under orders to, is another story. But he at least had somebody whispering in his ear. Anyway, thank you guys for coming by. It's just a little impromptu live event. I wanted to try streaming to 2 channels at once, and now I can say I've done that. I'm going to do more of these kind of things because it's kind of fun for me. But everybody have a good night. See you on the next one. Bye.